May 30th, 1961. The time is approaching 10 p.m., and the coastal air off the Caribbean Sea hangs over the city like a hot, wet towel. The smell of salt and rotting seaweed drifts off the water. A blue 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air hums down Avenida George Washington, the wide, palm-lined boulevard that traces the edge of the Dominican capital. The tires sing a low rhythm against the asphalt as the vehicle leaves the heavily fortified center of the city behind. In the back seat, staring out at the black expanse of the ocean, sits Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. He is 69 years old. Tonight, he is dressed in a sharply pressed olive military uniform, his chest heavy with the medals of a generalissimo. He is heading out of the city, taking the highway west toward his hometown of San Cristobal to visit a young mistress at his mahogany house estate. For a man who has held an entire nation by the throat for 31 years, his security posture tonight borders on the absurd. He is not traveling with his usual phalanx of armored cars. He has no outriders checking the intersections ahead, no machine gunners sitting in the beds of pickup trucks. Hubris is a hell of a drug, and after 3 decades of playing God, Trujillo believes his mere presence is armor enough. He travels with a single companion, his civilian chauffeur, a man named Zacharias. Behind them, cutting through the dark, a black Chevrolet approaches in the passing lane. The driver eases onto the gas, closing the gap until the black car matches the Bel Air's pace. For a few agonizing, drawn-out seconds, the two vehicles cruise parallel in the tropical night. The men in the black car look across the gap. They can see the silhouette of the dictator in the back seat. Then, a 12-gauge shotgun blast shatters the Bel Air's rear window. To understand how Rafael Trujillo ended up bleeding on a dark highway, caught in a textbook crossfire by his own inner circle, you have to understand the machine he built. Trujillo didn't just run the Dominican Republic, he owned it. He operated the country less like a sovereign nation and more like a massive, highly profitable protection racket, masquerading as a state. Before he took power, the Dominican Republic was a volatile, decentralized mess. Regional warlords with private militias constantly jockeyed for control. If a president became unpopular in the capital, an armed rebellion would spark in the rural provinces, gather momentum, and eventually march down out of the mountains to force a resignation. The cycle repeated itself for decades, a chaotic but strangely functional political ecosystem. That dynamic was permanently destroyed in 1916. The United States, anxious about European influence in the Caribbean during World War I and eager to collect unpaid customs debts, sent the Marines to occupy the island. The American expeditionary commanders had zero interest in negotiating with local warlords or navigating complex regional politics. They wanted order, and they wanted it cheaply. They systematically hunted down and dismantled the regional militias. In their place, they built a single, centralized proxy force called the Constabulary Guard. They took local kids, handed them Springfield rifles, and taught them how to run a modern military. They taught them logistics, intelligence gathering, and the absolute necessity of a rigid chain of command. One of the recruits was a former telegraph operator who had spent his youth running with a street gang called the 42, dabbling in petty theft and check forgery. His name was Rafael Trujillo. He didn't care about political ideology. He cared about ledgers, supply chains, and leverage. Trujillo realized immediately that the occupying Americans were handing out a total monopoly on state violence. He also understood something the old warlords never grasped. Violence is inherently sloppy and inefficient unless you wrap it in a bureaucracy. He rose rapidly through the ranks, proving himself an excellent quartermaster and a ruthless enforcer. By the time the Americans packed up and left in 1928, declaring the country stabilized, they left the keys to the entire military apparatus in Trujillo's hands. In 1930, the old political cycle tried to reassert itself. An armed rebellion against the sitting president, Horacio Vázquez, began moving toward the capital. Vázquez ordered Trujillo to deploy the military to the hills to crush the revolt. Trujillo simply ignored the order. He locked his troops in their barracks and watched. He let the rebels march into the city, let them overthrow the government, and let the political chaos settle. Then, when everyone was exhausted, he used his entirely intact military to casually step into the power vacuum. He organized a national election where he ran for president. His soldiers violently harassed the opposition candidates, broke up their rallies, and intimidated their supporters until every rival dropped out. Unsurprisingly, Trujillo received 99% of the vote. 3 weeks into his new presidency, nature handed him a masterpiece of timing. A massive, devastating hurricane named San Zenon slammed directly into the capital. The storm killed thousands, leveled the city's fragile infrastructure, and left corpses rotting in the Caribbean heat. It was a humanitarian nightmare. But for Trujillo, it was a blank canvas. He declared martial law, suspended all civil liberties, and seized total control of the International Red Cross emergency relief funds. He used the disaster to pour the concrete for his new totalitarian state. He rebuilt the city entirely in his own image, and when the dust settled, he renamed the capital Ciudad Trujillo. He even erected a massive neon sign over the harbor that read, without a hint of irony, Dios y Trujillo, God and Trujillo. He maintained his grip on the political elite through a system of microscopic, obsessive blackmail. Whenever a military officer or rising politician gained prominence, Trujillo would invite the man to his private estate. Before they could leave, he forced them to sign an undated letter of resignation. He kept hundreds of these letters locked in a steel vault in the National Palace. If a man ever stepped out of line, questioned a tariff policy, or showed too much independent ambition, Trujillo didn't necessarily have him killed. He would just pull the letter from the vault, date it, and publish it on the front page of the state-run newspaper. The man's career, his social standing, and his access to wealth evaporated instantly. He controlled the economy with the same suffocating grip. He owned the banks, the meatpacking plants, the milk monopolies, and the shoe factories. If you were a state employee, you were legally required to buy your uniform exclusively from his textile mills. But soldiers and spies are expensive, and to control a country of millions, you need a system where the citizens actively police themselves. Trujillo accomplished this by turning basic existence into a subscription service. He created a single legal political organization called the Partido Dominicano. Every adult had to carry a party membership card at all times. The locals called it Los Tres Golpes, the 3 strikes. To participate in society, you had to produce your national identification card, your military draft card, and your party card. You could not open a bank account, buy a piece of property, or even get a job as a street sweeper without sliding those 3 documents across a counter to a clerk. To ensure the party remained well-funded, Trujillo mandated an automatic 10% deduction from the salary of every state employee. The money bypassed the national treasury entirely and went straight into his personal accounts. The enforcement mechanism for this suffocating bureaucracy was the Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, the SIM. Under the command of Johnny Abbas Garcia, a former sports writer turned intellectual sadist, the SIM operated with total, terrifying impunity. They didn't bother hiding in the shadows. Terror works best when everyone knows exactly what it looks like. They drove black Volkswagen Beetles. The air-cooled engines had a distinct, sputtering whine. When you lay in bed sweating at 2 in the morning and you heard that sound coming down your street, you prayed it kept going. If a black Beetle idled at your curb, your life was over. The sim operated a specialized interrogation center at a prison called La Cuarenta. It wasn't a dungeon. It was an industrial facility designed to break human beings. The primary interrogation room featured an electric chair wired directly into the city's power grid. The guards affectionately called it the throne. This nightmare machine ran flawlessly for decades. The elite classes tolerated the humiliation and the fear because the arrangement was highly profitable and, as long as you followed the rules, physically safe. Totalitarianism relies on an unspoken contract. Applaud loudly enough, pay your bribes on time, and you get to live. But in the late 1950s, Trujillo started breaking his own rules. As he aged, he grew increasingly isolated and deeply paranoid. He stopped trusting his inner circle. He started demoting, humiliating, and destroying loyal generals without any rational explanation. Predictable terror keeps people in line because they know where the tripwires are hidden. Unpredictable terror makes them desperate. If absolute loyalty no longer guarantees your survival, the only logical move is to eliminate the source of the danger. The miscalculation compounded when his paranoia spilled over his borders. Ramiro Betancourt, the democratically elected president of Venezuela, openly criticized the Dominican regime on the international stage. In June 1960, Trujillo decided to solve this diplomatic annoyance with high explosives. He sent SIM agents into Caracas. They packed an Oldsmobile with dynamite, parked it along Betancourt's motorcade route, and detonated it using a radio transmitter. The blast killed the president's head of security and severely burned Betancourt. But he survived. The international blowback was instantaneous and crippling. The Organization of American States unanimously severed diplomatic ties and slapped severe economic sanctions on the Dominican Republic. The United States, which had backed Trujillo for decades simply because he was reliably anti-communist, suddenly realized the dictator was a massive, unstable liability. Fidel Castro had just taken over Cuba a year prior. The State Department panicked, fearing that Trujillo's erratic cruelty was going to trigger a communist revolution on the island next door. The CIA quietly began looking for ways to cut him loose. Domestically, the sanctions destroyed the Dominican economy. The elite families who had tolerated Trujillo's excesses suddenly lost their export markets and their access to foreign capital. The dictator was no longer making them rich, he was making them broke. Then came the final, fatal breach of protocol. In November 1960, SYM agents ambushed 3 upper-class women on a rural mountain road in Salcedo. Patria, Minerva, and Maria Teresa Mirabal, known in the underground resistance as the Butterflies, had been quietly organizing political opposition. They were returning from visiting their imprisoned husbands when the agents dragged them out of their vehicle. They dragged the women into a sugarcane field and beat them to death with clubs. To cover it up, they put the shattered bodies back into their jeep and pushed it off a cliff to stage a fatal accident. Autocrats murder dissidents constantly, but the Mirabal sisters were not armed guerrillas hiding in the jungle. They were wealthy, educated mothers from a prominent, aristocratic family. By bludgeoning them to death on a dirt road, Trujillo sent a horrifying message to the Dominican upper class. The old boundaries were gone. Wealth, status, and bloodlines offered zero protection anymore. He was coming for everyone. The men who eventually pulled the triggers on May 30th did not do it because they were impassioned lovers of liberal democracy. They were high-ranking military officers and wealthy businessmen. They were the exact men who drove the black Volkswagens, enforced the 10% tax, and signed the undated resignation letters. They decided to kill him because the risk of plotting a coup was suddenly lower than the risk of waking up tomorrow under a man who had completely lost his mind. But killing a man who owns the country is mostly a logistical nightmare. You cannot storm the palace. Trujillo's security apparatus insulated him from frontal assaults with layers of heavy machine guns, checkpoints, and fanatically loyal guards. To get him, you had to catch him in transit. And to catch him in transit, you needed a leak from inside the tightest circle of the regime. Antonio de la Maza was a wealthy construction contractor. Years earlier, he had learned the cost of doing business with the devil. In 1956, Trujillo's agents had kidnapped a political critic named Jesus de Galindez from the streets of Manhattan, smuggled him onto a private plane, flew him to the Dominican Republic, and murdered him. The American pilot of that plane, Jerry Murphy, started talking too much. The SIM murdered Murphy too. To cover their tracks and appease furious FBI investigators, the SIM needed a scapegoat. They framed de la Maza's brother, Octavio, threw him in a cell, and hung him from the ceiling to make it look like a suicide. Antonio de la Maza didn't rebel. He didn't publicly protest. He swallowed the official story, kept taking lucrative government construction contracts, smiled at the dictator's parties, and quietly waited for an opening to exact his revenge. He joined forces with Juan Tomás Díaz, a former general who Trujillo had abruptly stripped of his command and publicly humiliated. They gathered a small, desperate circle of co-conspirators, including Antonio Imber Barrera, a former provincial governor, and Pedro Livio Cedeño, a military veteran. Organizing a coup in a total surveillance state is a terrifyingly quiet endeavor. You do not hold meetings in basements. You do not use the telephone. If you need to talk to a co-conspirator, you wait for a noisy society wedding, stand in the corner with a drink in your hand, and speak without moving your lips. You assume your driver is an informant. You assume your house is bugged. You assume your wife's friends are reporting back to Johnny Abbeys. Then there was the problem of hardware. Standard handguns bounce off the reinforced steel of armored cars. Buying military rifles locally was impossible, as the SIM tracked every bullet imported onto the island. The guns had to come from the outside. This is where the CIA stepped in. The station chief in Ciudad Trujillo, Henry Dearborn, quietly managed the logistics. 3 M1 carbines didn't arrive on a Black Ops helicopter in the middle of the night. They came through the regular mail. They were disassembled and hidden inside the United States consulate's canvas diplomatic pouch, bypassing local customs inspectors entirely. The weapons were passed to the conspirators through an American expat who ran a local grocery store called Wimpy's. The plotters moved the disassembled rifles around the capital, hidden in plain brown paper grocery bags. But guns are useless without a target. Trujillo never announced his movements. He rarely slept in the same place twice. If the hitmen guessed his route and parked on the highway with illegal weapons, they had maybe 20 minutes before a police patrol checked their license plates. If they were caught, they wouldn't just be shot. They would be taken to La Cuarenta, strapped to the electric chair, and forced to watch the sim torture their wives and children. They needed an inside man. They found one in Lieutenant Amado Garcia Guerrero. Garcia Guerrero was an officer in the elite Presidential Guard. His primary job was to stand at attention directly behind the dictator's desk. His hatred for Trujillo was entirely personal, a wound inflicted by the regime's sheer cruelty. He had fallen in love with a woman named Luisa. but her family had subtle anti-regime ties. When Garcia Guerrero asked for permission to marry her, a strict requirement for all military officers, Trujillo denied it. Shortly after, the Sim took Garcia Guerrero to a courtyard, handed him a revolver, dragged a hooded prisoner out of a cell, and ordered the lieutenant to execute the man to prove his loyalty. Garcia Guerrero pulled the trigger. When the guards pulled the hood off the dead man, Garcia Guerrero realized he had just murdered his fiancé's brother. He didn't break. His soul died in that courtyard. But he went back to work. He stood at attention behind Trujillo's desk, perfectly still, and began memorizing the dictator's schedule. By late May 1961, the tension among the conspirators was unbearable. The plan was built around Trujillo's one predictable habit: his Wednesday evening visits to his mistress at his Mahogany House estate in San Cristobal. The route took him down the coastal highway. The assassins started staking out the road. On May 25th, they loaded the M1s into their cars and waited in the dark. Garcia Guerrero had sent word that Trujillo was moving. They sat for hours, sweating through their shirts in the tropical heat, their hearts hammering against their ribs at every pair of approaching headlights. Trujillo never showed. He changed his mind at the last minute. They went out again on May 28th. Another false alarm. Sitting in a hot car with a loaded M1 carbine, knowing Johnny Abbeys and his secret police are prowling the city, breaks human psychology. You start wondering if the man sitting next to you has already sold you out to save his own skin. You wonder if the Sim is just waiting for the right moment to box your car in. By the evening of Tuesday, May 30th, the coalition was exhausted. Some members wanted to call it off entirely. Their nerves were completely shredded. At the National Palace, Lieutenant Garcia Guerrero watched Trujillo put on his olive uniform. He watched him dismiss his military escort and call for his civilian chauffeur, Zacarias. Trujillo was definitely going to San Cristobal. Garcia Guerrero slipped away to a secure telephone. He dialed the number. He gave the signal. The dictator was walking out into the dark. Real violence is rarely a clean tactical maneuver. The collapse of the Trujillo regime took exactly 10 minutes, and it was a mechanical, bloody, terrifying mess. At 9:30 p.m., Trujillo walked out of the National Palace, climbed into the back of his unarmored blue Bel Air, and told Zacarias to drive. 10 minutes later, on the dark coastal stretch of Avenida George Washington, headlights rushed up behind them. Antonio Imbert was driving the pursuit car. Antonio de la Mazza sat in the passenger seat, the 12-gauge shotgun resting heavy across his lap. In the back, Garcia Guerrero and Pedro Livio Cedeño readied the M1 carbines, pulling the charging handles back with a sharp metallic clack. Imbert floored the gas pedal, pulling parallel to the dictator's car at highway speed. De la Mazza leaned out the window, aimed into the wind, and fired the shotgun point blank. Buckshot tore through the Bel Air's rear window and ripped into Trujillo's left shoulder. If Zacarias had simply pressed his foot down, they likely would have escaped. The Bel Air was a heavier, faster machine with a massive V8 engine. But the dictator made a fatal miscalculation. Having spent 3 decades playing a deity, Trujillo had completely forgotten how to be prey. He commanded Zacarias to hit the brakes. The Bel Air skidded to a halt on the asphalt, the tires shrieking. Trujillo grabbed his .38 caliber service revolver, kicked his door open, and stepped out into the humid night. He didn't crouch behind the heavy engine block for cover. He stood straight up in the dark, fully exposed, bleeding from his shoulder, actually expecting the men shooting at him to drop their weapons and cower at the mere sight of him. The assassins threw their Chevrolet into park and scrambled out. The gunfire that followed was deafening and completely chaotic. Zacharias grabbed a Luger pistol from the floorboards and returned fire, managing to shoot Cedeno in the stomach. There was no grand tactical flanking maneuver. It was just desperate men emptying magazines at close range in the dark. Trujillo walked forward into the glaring headlights of the assassin's car, firing his revolver. The M1 carbines tore him apart. He took rounds to the chest, the jaw, and the torso. The man who owned the country's banks, its military infrastructure, and its history collapsed face first onto the road. The shooting stopped. The heavy silence of the coastline rushed back in, broken only by the ticking of the hot car engines and the sound of waves hitting the seawall. De la Maza walked up to the bleeding dictator, looking down at the man who had ordered the murder of his brother. De la Maza aimed his weapon and fired a final, point-blank insurance shot into Trujillo's chin. The conspirators didn't pause to celebrate. Panic set in immediately. They grabbed Trujillo by the boots, dragged his heavy body across the highway, and heaved him into the trunk of their Chevrolet. They slammed the lid shut. In their frantic rush to escape, they made a massive logistical error. They left Zacharias bleeding heavily in the grass, assuming the chauffeur was dead. At 10 p.m., none of that mattered. The men got in their car, whipped it around, and drove back toward the capital. Behind them, a pool of blood soaked into the highway. Inside their trunk, the architect of the Dominican terror state was reduced to dead weight. History is usually written by the survivors, but autocracies rarely survive their founders. Zacharias, the bleeding chauffeur, was very much alive. He managed to drag himself up to the highway shoulder, flag down a passing car, and get to a military hospital. By midnight, Johnny Abes and the SIM had a complete physical description of every man in the hit squad. The aftermath was a bloodbath. Trujillo's son, Ramfis, a playboy who spent state millions dating Hollywood actresses, immediately flew back from Paris to take control of the country. He didn't want a public trial. He wanted vengeance, and he wanted to preserve the myth of his father's invincibility. The regime's newspapers printed a sanitized narrative, framing the ambush as a cowardly foreign plot backed by communist agitators. They erased the inconvenient reality that the architects of the assassination were the regime's own loyalists. The SIM hunted the conspirators down like animals. They dragged them back to La Cuarenta. They strapped them to the electric chair, tortured them for months, and eventually marched them to a firing squad. Only Antonio Imber survived, hiding out in a friend's house while the secret police tore the city apart. But the terror had lost its center of gravity. The machine was built around one man, and without the man who held the vault full of blackmail files, the system fragmented rapidly. The generals stopped taking orders from Ramfis. The business elite quietly stopped paying the 10% tax. The Americans moved naval destroyers off the coast to ensure the regime didn't try to pull the country down with it. Within 6 months, Ramfis realized the math had permanently turned against him. The machine was eating itself. He gave up. He loaded his father's casket onto a luxury yacht, emptied millions of dollars from the central bank into heavy canvas bags, and sailed out of the country forever, leaving behind a traumatized nation to finally wake up from a 31-year nightmare.